For 42 years. Up here in the mountains, Silas Combs poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the boy the government took from him. In 1951, 19 federal agents raiding the wrong...
He lived 42 years alone after slaughtering 19 federal agents who killed his 10-year-old son. He vanished into the wilderness and became a ghost that the federal government could not find. For 42 years, the mountains sheltered a man whose grief had turned to fury, whose fury had turned to vengeance, and whose vengeance had turned to silence so complete that the world forgot he had ever existed. 19 federal agents died in the autumn of 1947, and the man who killed them was never caught, never suspected, never found until his body was discovered in a cave that had been his home for more than 4 decades. This is the true story of Ezekiel Fugate, the ghost of Black Mountain. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields. During the years after World War II, when returning veterans found a world that had changed in ways they had not anticipated. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had sent their sons to fight in distant lands, and who now welcomed them back to a region where federal authority had grown stronger during the years of their absence. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, the federal government was asserting control in ways that mountain families found increasingly intolerable. Revenue agents enforced Prohibition-era laws that had technically ended, but that continued in practice through regulations and taxation that made traditional whiskey-making economically impossible. Land agents surveyed properties for federal projects that would displace families who had lived on their land for generations. The government that had asked these families to send their sons to war now seemed determined to destroy the way of life those sons had fought to defend. The man at the center of our story was named Ezekiel Fugate, and he had returned from the war in 1945 with wounds that were not visible, but that had changed him in ways that those who knew him before could see clearly. He had fought in the Pacific, had survived battles whose names would become famous in history books, had killed men whose faces still visited him in dreams that made sleep something to be endured rather than welcomed. He had come home to the mountains that had raised him, hoping to find peace in the land that had always provided it. Ezekiel was 32 years old when he returned from the war, a man whose body was still strong, but whose spirit carried burdens that the mountains could not entirely lift. He stood 6 feet tall, had dark hair that was beginning to show threads of gray despite his youth, possessed eyes that had seen things no man should see, and that now looked at the world with a wariness that never entirely relaxed. His hands, which had learned to kill in the jungle islands of the Pacific, now worked the land that his family had occupied for 4 generations. That's right. Ezekiel Fugate was a veteran who had served his country with distinction, had earned medals that he kept in a drawer and never displayed, had done everything that his nation had asked of him. He had believed, in the way that soldiers must believe to survive, that the sacrifice was worth the cost, that the world he would return to would justify the horrors he had experienced, but the world he returned to was not the world he had left. His wife, Sarah, had died during the influenza outbreak of 1944, leaving behind a son who had been raised by grandparents, while his father fought on islands whose names the boy could not pronounce. Ezekiel's parents were aging rapidly, worn down by years of worry and by the labor of raising a grandchild while their son was at war. The homestead that had once seemed eternal now felt fragile, vulnerable to forces that had not existed when Ezekiel had departed. The son was named Thomas, and he was 8 years old when his father returned from the war. The boy had been only 5 when Ezekiel had shipped out, old enough to have memories of his father, but young enough that those memories had faded into vague impressions rather than clear recollections. The man who returned was a stranger, someone whose face matched photographs, but whose presence was different from anything the boy remembered. Ezekiel worked to build a relationship with the son he barely knew, struggled against the awkwardness that separated a father who had been at war from a child who had grown up in his absence. Thomas was cautious at first, uncertain of this man who lived in the house and who claimed the role that photographs said he deserved. But children are adaptable, and within months the awkwardness had begun to fade, replaced by a bond that deepened with each shared experience. They hunted together in forests that Ezekiel had known since childhood, the father teaching skills that generations of Fugates had passed down. They fished in streams that ran cold and clear through hollows where the outside world seemed impossibly distant. They worked side by side on the farm that provided most of what the family needed, the physical labor creating connection that words could not achieve. By 1947, Thomas was 10 years old, and Ezekiel had finally begun to feel like a father rather than a stranger living in the same house as his son. The bond between them had become the center of Ezekiel's existence, the purpose that gave meaning to days that might otherwise have been empty. His parents had died in 1946 within months of each other, leaving Ezekiel and Thomas alone on the property that the family had occupied since before the Civil War. The trouble that would destroy this fragile peace began with the arrival of federal agents in Harlan County, men whose mission was to enforce regulations that the mountain families had never accepted, and that seemed designed to punish traditional ways of life. A new supervisor named Vernon Crawford had been assigned to the regional office, a man whose zeal for enforcement exceeded anything the county had previously experienced. Crawford was not a veteran. He had spent the war years in government offices, had risen through bureaucratic channels while other men fought and died on foreign beaches. He had developed a particular contempt for mountain families that he considered backward and lawless, a contempt that expressed itself through enforcement policies that were aggressive even by federal standards. The Fugate property attracted Crawford's attention because of reports that Ezekiel was operating a small still, producing whiskey for personal use and occasional barter with neighbors. The operation was modest, nothing that would have attracted notice under previous enforcement regimes, but Crawford had announced a policy of zero tolerance that made no distinction between commercial operations and family traditions. The raid was planned for October 15, 1947, exactly 2 years after Ezekiel had returned from the war. Crawford assembled a team of 19 agents, far more than any legitimate enforcement purpose could have required, and approached the Fugate property with force that suggested military operation rather than law enforcement. Ezekiel was away from home that morning. He had traveled to the county seat to purchase supplies and to conduct business that required his presence in town. Thomas remained at the homestead, had been told to complete chores while his father was away, had no reason to expect that the ordinary morning would become anything other than ordinary. The agents arrived in vehicles that Thomas heard approaching while he was feeding the animals in the barn. The boy emerged to find armed men surrounding the house, their weapons drawn and their expressions suggesting hostility that he could not understand. He was 10 years old, had done nothing wrong, had no idea why these strangers were treating his home like a battlefield. Crawford approached the boy with questions that Thomas could not answer because he did not know the answers. Where was the still? Where was his father hiding? Who else was involved in the illegal operation? The questions came faster than the boy could process them, each accompanied by implied threats that a child should never have faced. "I don't know about any still," Thomas said, his voice trembling, but his words truthful. "My daddy isn't hiding anywhere. He went to town this morning. He'll be back soon." Crawford did not believe the boy, or perhaps he did not care whether Thomas was telling the truth. The supervisor had developed theories about the Fugate operation that facts would not be allowed to contradict, had convinced himself that the family was part of a larger network that his career required him to expose. The child's denials were interpreted as evidence of coaching, proof that the family had prepared lies to obstruct federal authority. The search that followed was deliberately destructive, agents tearing through the house and barn with enthusiasm that suggested purposes beyond finding evidence. They broke furniture and scattered possessions, destroyed items that had been in the family for generations, demonstrated the power that their badges provided in ways that left no doubt about who controlled this situation. Thomas watched the destruction of his home with tears streaming down his face, begged the agents to stop, tried to explain that his father would be home soon, and would tell them whatever they wanted to know. His pleas were ignored by men who had already decided that the Fugate family represented an enemy that must be defeated. The still was found in the location where it had always been, a small operation in a hollow behind the barn that produced whiskey in quantities too modest to justify the force that had been assembled. Crawford examined the evidence with satisfaction that seemed disproportionate to the discovery. ordered his men to destroy the equipment with an enthusiasm that suggested personal hatred rather than professional duty. And then something happened that would transform a routine enforcement action into tragedy that no report would accurately describe. Thomas ran. The boy saw agents approaching with torches to burn the still and the shed that housed it, understood that they intended to destroy something his father had built with his own hands, something that connected them to generations of fugates who had practiced the same craft. He acted on an impulse that children often act on without considering consequences, the impulse to protect what belongs to his family, to do something rather than stand helplessly while strangers destroyed his world. He ran toward the shed, his legs carrying him faster than his mind could process the danger. He was thinking of his father, of how disappointed Ezekiel would be to return and find everything destroyed, of how hard his father had worked to build something that these strangers were treating as worthless. He was thinking of his grandfather, who had taught his father the craft and whose memory lived in the copper and wood that the agents were preparing to burn. An agent named Dale Tackett saw the boy running and reacted with instincts that had been developed for situations entirely different from apprehending a 10-year-old child on his own property. Tackett had served briefly in the war, had been stationed far from combat, had never faced actual danger but had absorbed the training that prepared men to respond to threats with lethal force. He saw movement, perceived threat where none existed, drew his weapon and fired with the automatic response that training had installed. Thomas Fugate was shot twice. The first bullet struck his shoulder, spun him around with force that lifted him off his feet. The impact was like being hit by something massive, a blow that interrupted everything he was thinking and feeling, and replaced it with pain that exceeded anything he had experienced. He did not understand what had happened, did not connect the sound he had heard with the fire that was spreading through his body. The second bullet struck his chest as he turned, entered his body between ribs that were still growing, passed through organs that had decades of life remaining. The bullet found his heart and ended everything that Thomas Fugate was or would ever become. He was dead before he hit the ground, a 10-year-old boy whose only crime had been loving his father enough to try to protect what his father had built. His body landed in dirt that his ancestors had walked on for generations, in soil that held the remains of fugates who had lived and died on this land for a century and a half. His eyes remained open, staring at a sky that was the same blue it had been moments before, the same sky he had looked at that morning when his father had left and everything had been normal and the future had seemed like something that would continue indefinitely. The agent stood in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the reality of what had just happened penetrating even the most callous among them. Some turned away, unable to look at what they had participated in. Others stared with expressions that suggested they were trying to convince themselves that what they were seeing was not what they were seeing. A child lay dead in the dirt of his own property, killed by federal agents who had come to destroy a whiskey, still that produced perhaps 10 gallons a month. The mission that had seemed routine when they assembled that morning had become something that would mark every man present for the rest of his life, something that would divide their existence into before and after. Crawford was the first to recover, the first to begin constructing the narrative that would protect his men and his career from the consequences of what had just occurred. His mind worked quickly, assessing the situation, identifying the elements that would be needed to transform a murder into a justified shooting. He had experience with such transformations, had learned during his bureaucratic career how reports could be written to support conclusions that facts alone would not justify. The boy was armed, Crawford announced, his voice carrying the authority that his position provided. He threatened Agent Tackett with a weapon. The shooting was justified self-defense. Some of the agents looked at him with confusion, knowing that what he was saying was not what had happened. Thomas had not been armed, had not threatened anyone, had simply run toward a shed that his father had built. But they understood what Crawford was doing, understood that the alternative to accepting his narrative was accepting responsibility for the death of a child. The choice was not difficult for men who valued their careers and their freedom. The weapon that was found nearby was a hunting rifle that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather, a rifle that the boy had never been allowed to touch because Ezekiel had taught him that firearms were not toys and that he would learn to use them properly when he was old enough. The rifle had been stored in the house, had been found during the search that preceded the shooting, had been set aside as evidence of the family's lawlessness. Now an agent retrieved it and placed it near Thomas's body, creating the scene that would support the story they were constructing. "Make sure your reports reflect what actually happened here," Crawford instructed his men, his voice making clear that what actually happened meant what he had described rather than what they had witnessed. The boy was armed and threatening. Agent Tackett had no choice. This was a tragic but justified response to resistance. The lie was constructed quickly, each agent contributing details that made the story more believable. Thomas had emerged from the house carrying the rifle. He had shouted threats that agents had heard clearly. He had raised the weapon in a manner that left Tackett no choice but to fire. The fabrication was collaborative, each participant adding elements that protected himself and his colleagues from the truth of what had occurred. The body was left where it fell, while agents completed their destruction of the still and prepared to depart. No one covered Thomas's face. No one closed his eyes. No one showed the respect that even enemies typically showed to the dead. He was evidence now, a prop in a story that would be told to protect the men who had killed him. His death transformed from tragedy to justified action through the alchemy of official reports. Crawford ordered his men to finish their work efficiently, to be gone before the father returned, to avoid any confrontation that might complicate the narrative they had constructed. They burned the still and the shed that housed it, destroyed the last evidence of the craft that Fugates had practiced for generations, left nothing but ashes and a dead child to mark their visit. They drove away without looking back, left Thomas lying in the dirt of a property his family had occupied for generations. The dust from their vehicles settled on his body, mixing with the blood that had pooled beneath him, covering the evidence of what they had done with a thin layer of earth that seemed eager to begin the process of concealment. Ezekiel returned that afternoon to find his world destroyed. He saw the destruction first, the broken furniture visible through windows, the scattered possessions that littered the yard. The house he had grown up in, the home where his parents had raised him and where he had hoped to raise Thomas, looked like it had been attacked by enemies in a war that no one had declared. He felt the first stirrings of fear, the instinct that something was terribly wrong, the premonition that the life he had been building was about to collapse. He called Thomas's name as he approached, expected the boy to emerge from somewhere with an explanation for what had happened. Thomas always came when called, was reliable in ways that exceeded what Ezekiel would have expected from a 10-year-old, would not have failed to respond unless something prevented him. The silence that answered his calls was the first indication that the wrongness he sensed was worse than he had imagined. He searched the house first, called Thomas's name as he moved through rooms that had been ransacked by men whose destruction had been deliberate rather than incidental. He found nothing, no sign of his son, no indication of where Thomas might have gone or been taken. The fear that had been building became something closer to panic, an urgency that drove him outside to search the property that had always seemed safe. He found his son behind the barn, lying in dirt that had been soaked with blood that was already beginning to dry in the autumn sun. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Ezekiel could not process what he was seeing, could not connect the small body on the ground with the son he had held that morning, could not accept that what he was looking at was real. The boy's eyes were open, staring at a sky that he could no longer see, his expression frozen in the surprise that death had not given him time to process. His hands were empty, his posture suggesting that he had been running rather than fighting, his wounds telling a story that the official report would contradict, but that a father's eyes could read clearly. Ezekiel knelt beside his son, and the sound that emerged from him was not human. It was the sound of something breaking that had already been broken once by war, and that this second breaking would never repair. It was the sound of a father discovering that the thing he had fought to return home to, the thing he had lived for since Sarah's death, the thing that gave meaning to an existence that war had damaged beyond normal repair, that thing was gone, was lying in the dirt with eyes that would never see anything again. He gathered Thomas into his arms, held the body that was already growing cold, felt the weight that had been so alive that morning becoming something else, something that physics could measure, but that love could not accept. He rocked back and forth while sounds continued to emerge that no one was present to hear, sounds that the mountains absorbed without response, sounds that expressed grief for which no language had adequate words. He stayed with the body through the night, held his son while the stars wheeled overhead, and the temperature dropped and the world continued to turn as though nothing had happened. He did not eat, did not sleep, did not release the burden that he had held since finding it. He simply existed in a grief that exceeded anything he had experienced, including the horrors of war that had seemed like the worst things any human could endure. The neighbors who arrived the next morning, drawn by smoke they had seen the previous day, and by concern for a family they had known for generations, found Ezekiel still holding his son, still making sounds that were no longer words, still existing in a place that the living could not reach. They buried Thomas that afternoon, in the Fugate family cemetery where generations of the family rested. Ezekiel dug the grave himself, refused help from neighbors who offered it, insisted on performing this final service for the son whose life he had been unable to protect. He lowered the small body into the earth, covered it with dirt that seemed inadequate for such a burden, marked the grave with stones that he carved himself through a night of labor that his hands performed without conscious direction. The investigation that followed was corrupt in ways that would only become apparent decades later. The official report described a dangerous confrontation in which agents had been forced to defend themselves against armed resistance. Thomas Fugate was described as a participant in illegal activities who had threatened agents with a firearm, whose death was regrettable but justified. The agents involved were cleared of any wrongdoing, their careers unaffected by the killing of a 10-year-old boy. Ezekiel listened to the official conclusion with the silence that had consumed him since Thomas's burial. He did not argue, did not protest, did not reveal the fury that was building behind eyes that had grown as empty as his son's grave. The neighbors who checked on him regularly reported that he seemed to be recovering, that he was eating again and performing the work that the farm required. They did not see what was happening beneath the surface, did not understand that the man they were checking on was no longer the man they had known. The transformation took 6 weeks. During those weeks, Ezekiel used the skills that the war had taught him and the connections that mountain families maintained to gather intelligence about the agents who had killed his son. He learned their names and their faces, their routines and their vulnerabilities, their homes and their families. He compiled a list of 19 targets, and he studied that list with the same attention he had once given to enemy positions in the Pacific Islands. He did not share his plans with anyone. The neighbors who visited saw a grieving father who seemed to be healing, who spoke little, but who showed signs of returning to functionality. They did not see the weapons he was accumulating, the supplies he was gathering, the preparations he was making for a campaign that would consume the remaining purpose of his existence. The campaign began on November 27, 1947, 6 weeks after Thomas's death. The first target was Dale Tackett, the agent who had fired the shots that killed Thomas. Tackett had been transferred to a different district after the incident, had believed himself beyond any consequence of what he had done, was living in a small town in Virginia, where he continued his career without any thought of the enemies he had made. Ezekiel found him through the network, traveled to Virginia by routes that left no record of his journey, located Tackett in the boarding house, where he was staying while on assignment. The war had taught Ezekiel how to move through enemy territory without being detected, how to approach targets without alerting them, how to kill quickly and silently when silence was necessary. Tackett died in his bed, his throat cut so deeply that he could not make a sound, his eyes open with surprise that there had been no time to process. Ezekiel left nothing that could identify him, took nothing that could be traced, departed through the same routes he had used to arrive. The body was found the next morning. The investigation concluded that Tackett had been killed by someone he had arrested during his career, someone whose identity would never be determined. The second killing came 2 weeks later, claiming Robert Lawson, another agent who had been present at the Fugate property. Lawson was found in his home, killed by a method that matched what had been done to Tackett, displaying the same evidence of skill that suggested a killer who knew exactly what he was doing. That's right. Ezekiel continued his campaign through the winter of 1947 to 48, taking his targets one by one with regularity that demonstrated patience exceeding what ordinary rage could produce. The third killing came in December, the fourth in January, each following patterns that investigators could recognize but could not predict. The fear that spread through the regional federal offices was unlike anything they had experienced. Agents who had participated in the Fugate raid were dying, killed by someone whose identity remained invisible, despite every investigative resource that was deployed. The connection to the Fugate case became obvious once the pattern was recognized, but the obvious suspect, the grieving father, had been under observation and showed no signs of the capability that the killings demonstrated. Some agents requested transfers, hoping that distance would provide safety. Others resigned entirely, deciding that no career was worth the risk of dying as their colleagues had died. A few demanded protection that the agency struggled to provide, resources that were inadequate against a killer who had been trained by the United States military to do exactly what he was now doing. The fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth killings came in rapid succession as spring arrived. Ezekiel's pace accelerating as the remaining agents' fear made them careless. Men who were afraid made mistakes, revealed vulnerabilities they would have concealed in calmer times, provided opportunities that a patient hunter knew how to exploit. The ninth killing claimed an agent who had helped construct the false narrative about Thomas's death had testified that the boy had been armed and threatening. This agent had been placed under protective custody, had guards stationed at his home, had taken every precaution that federal resources could provide. None of it mattered against a man who had spent years learning to reach targets that seemed unreachable. The 10th through 15th killings cleared most of the agents who had been present at the Fugate property, each death adding to a toll that had begun to seem inevitable. The newspapers had begun calling the killer the Mountain Ghost, attributing the deaths to some figure whose capabilities exceeded what any ordinary person could possess. Crawford himself had gone into hiding, had requested protection that exceeded anything previously provided to a federal employee, had surrounded himself with guards who watched for threats that never seemed to arrive in any form they could anticipate. He understood that he was the ultimate target, that whoever was killing his agents would eventually come for him, that his career of destroying mountain families had created an enemy whose determination exceeded anything he had imagined. The 16th and 17th killings claimed guards who had been assigned to protect Crawford, men who were taken from positions directly outside the safe house where the supervisor was hiding. The message was clear. No protection could save those who had participated in Thomas Fugate's death. No distance could place them beyond the reach of justice that courts had refused to provide. The 18th killing was elaborate in ways the previous deaths had not been. The agent who died had been the one to place the rifle beside Thomas's body, had helped construct the lie that justified the killing of a child. Ezekiel wanted him to understand why he was dying, wanted him to experience something of the fear that Thomas must have felt in his final moments. The agent was found 3 days after his disappearance, in a location that suggested he had been held somewhere before being killed. The condition of the body indicated that the death had not been quick, that the killer had taken time to ensure that this victim understood exactly what was happening and why. Crawford disappeared on April 15, 1948, exactly 6 months after the raid that had killed Thomas Fugate. His safe house was found empty. His guards were unharmed, but had seen nothing. His body would never be found despite searches that continued for years. The 19th and final victim had simply vanished, taken by a killer who had decided that Crawford deserved something worse than a quick death. What Ezekiel did to Crawford during the days before the supervisor finally died would never be known with certainty. The confession that would eventually be discovered suggested that Crawford's end was prolonged in ways that matched the prolonged suffering that Thomas's death had inflicted on his father. Ezekiel had created a symmetry of pain, had ensured that the man most responsible for his son's death experienced consequences that exceeded anything the legal system could have provided. With Crawford's death, the campaign was complete. 19 federal agents had died over 5 months, every man who had participated in the raid that killed Thomas Fugate, every man who had helped construct the lie that justified his death. The investigation that followed was the largest in federal history to that point, but it produced nothing useful. The Mountain Ghost remained invisible, his identity unknown, his methods unexplained, and then Ezekiel Fugate disappeared. He had planned his withdrawal as carefully as he had planned his campaign. The mountain property was sold to distant relatives who knew nothing of what he had done, the proceeds distributed to families who had helped him during the months of killing. He gathered supplies that would sustain him through years of solitude, acquired tools and materials that would allow him to survive without any contact with the world he was leaving behind. He walked into Black Mountain on a spring morning in 1948, and he did not walk out. The federal agents who were watching his property saw nothing. The neighbors who had been observing him saw nothing. The world that might have stopped him if it had known his plans saw nothing. Ezekiel Fugate simply ceased to exist in any form that the outside world could detect. The wilderness of eastern Kentucky contained thousands of square miles that no one had fully explored, terrain so rugged that a man who knew what he was doing could disappear forever. Ezekiel knew what he was doing. He had grown up in these mountains, had learned their secrets from a father who had learned them from a father before him, possessed knowledge of the land that exceeded what any outsider could have acquired in a lifetime of study. He found a cave system that no one else knew existed, a series of chambers deep within Black Mountain that provided shelter from weather and concealment from any search. His grandfather had shown him the entrance when he was a boy, had explained that the Fugates had known about these caves for generations, had used them during times when hiding was necessary. The entrance was hidden by vegetation that he cultivated to make detection impossible, accessible only through a route that required knowledge of features that appeared on no map. The cave became his home for 42 years. The main chamber was large enough to serve as living quarters, with a ceiling high enough to stand beneath and walls that were dry despite the moisture that pervaded much of the underground system. A smaller chamber served as storage for the supplies he accumulated, protected from the dampness that would have destroyed materials stored elsewhere. A third chamber, deeper within the mountain, provided access to water that flowed through limestone channels and that emerged cold and pure regardless of the season. He lived in darkness that he learned to navigate without light, his other senses developing to compensate for the absence of vision. He learned to identify chambers by their acoustic properties, by the way sound reflected from walls, whose shapes he memorized through touch. He moved through spaces that would have been terrifying to anyone accustomed to light, spaces that became as familiar to him as the farmhouse where he had grown up had once been. The garden he created was his masterpiece of survival engineering. He found a location where a shaft in the cave system allowed sunlight to reach a small area of soil that accumulated at the base of a rockfall. The light was limited to a few hours each day, and only during certain seasons, but it was enough to grow vegetables that supplemented the meat he obtained from the forest. He expanded the growing area over years, carrying soil from the surface in small amounts that would not attract attention, creating a garden that produced food in quantities that exceeded what he needed. The hunting was done with traps and snares that left no evidence of human presence, techniques that his ancestors had used for generations and that the war had refined into something more systematic. He learned the patterns of animals that lived on Black Mountain, identified the routes they traveled and the locations where they fed, positioned his traps with precision that produced consistent results. The meat he took was processed in the cave, smoked over fires whose smoke was dispersed through channels that prevented any visible plume from emerging on the surface. He ate food that he grew in his hidden garden, and meat that he took from the forest with traps that left no evidence of human presence. The diet was monotonous but adequate, providing the nutrition that his body required to continue functioning through decades of isolation. He supplemented it with plants that he gathered from the forest during careful expeditions that left no trace of his passage, herbs and roots and berries that his mother had taught him to identify, and that provided variety and additional nutrients. He spoke to no one, saw no one, existed in isolation so complete that his humanity might have dissolved if not for the purpose that sustained him. The solitude was not always easy, particularly in the early years when the habits of social existence had not yet been replaced by new patterns. He sometimes caught himself speaking aloud, addressing companions who were not present, engaging in conversations that existed only in his mind. Over time, these moments became less frequent, replaced by an internal dialogue that required no vocalization. The loneliness would have destroyed most people, would have driven them back to civilization regardless of the consequences. But Ezekiel had a purpose that transcended the need for human contact, a connection that the isolation could not sever. His son was with him always, present in memories that 40 years could not diminish, alive in a way that physical death could not entirely end. He visited Thomas's grave. This was the single connection he maintained with the world he had abandoned, the one journey he made from his wilderness refuge to the place where his son was buried. Once each year, on the anniversary of Thomas's death, Ezekiel traveled through routes that no one else knew to the cemetery, where Fugates had been buried for generations. The journey took 3 days each way, traversing terrain that would have been impassable for anyone without his intimate knowledge of the mountains. He moved only at night, avoided any path that might be traveled by others, approached the cemetery only after observing it for hours to ensure that no one was present. The precautions seemed excessive after years had passed without any sign of pursuit, but habits developed in wartime and reinforced by months of killing did not easily fade. He stood at his son's grave for hours, spoke words that no one was present to hear, performed rituals of memory that kept the boy alive in his mind. He told Thomas about the year that had passed, about the seasons he had observed, and the animals he had encountered, about the thoughts that occupied a mind that had no other outlet for expression. "I miss you," he would say, his voice rusty from months of silence. "I miss you every day, every hour, every minute. The world doesn't make sense without you in it. But I'm still here, still waiting, still loving you even though you're gone. Someday I'll be with you again, and we'll have all of eternity to make up for the time that was stolen from us." He brought gifts each year, small objects that he had made during the month since his last visit, carved animals that Thomas would have loved, whittled from wood that he shaped during long winter nights when the cave was his entire world, stones that he had polished to smoothness, selected for colors that he remembered Thomas admiring during their walks through the forest, flowers that he gathered on the journey, pressed and preserved in ways that his mother had taught him, placed on the grave as offerings that no one but the dead would see. The neighbors who maintained the cemetery noticed that Thomas's grave was always clear of weeds, always showed signs of recent attention, always had small objects placed on the stone that they did not recognize. They attributed these signs to unknown relatives, to someone who cared for the grave but who preferred anonymity, to acts of devotion whose source they could not identify. They did not imagine that the boy's father was still alive, still visiting, still maintaining a connection that 42 years of solitude could not sever. They could not have imagined the truth, because the truth exceeded anything that ordinary experience could encompass. A man living alone in a cave for decades, surviving on skills that most people had forgotten existed, making an annual pilgrimage to his son's grave through terrain that would have defeated anyone without his capabilities. The scenario was too improbable for minds accustomed to ordinary possibilities. The years accumulated like sediment, each one adding its weight to the burden that Ezekiel carried. He marked their passage with carvings on the cave walls, a tally that grew longer with each October that came and went. He watched the seasons change from vantage points that allowed him to observe the world without being observed, saw the forests shift through cycles of growth and dormancy that repeated themselves with variations too subtle for most people to notice. He saw changes in the world beyond his refuge, evidence of technological progress that reached even these remote mountains. Aircraft passed overhead more frequently as the years progressed, their sounds penetrating to depths that natural noise could not reach. Roads were built that had not existed when he began his isolation, their construction audible from miles away during periods when the work was underway. The world was changing in ways that made his continued concealment both easier and more remarkable. Easier because attention was focused elsewhere, more remarkable because the contrast between his existence and the world's grew larger with each passing year. Ezekiel aged in his cave, his body growing weaker while his mind remained clear. The physical capabilities that had allowed him to survive diminished gradually, forcing adaptations that his intelligence devised and his determination implemented. Tasks that had been easy in his 50s became difficult in his 60s, became exhausting in his 70s, became impossible in the final years when his body would no longer respond to his will. He kept journals that documented his days and his thoughts, wrote letters to Thomas that he would never send, but that allowed him to maintain the relationship that death had not ended. The journals filled notebooks that he made from materials he gathered in the forest, pages of bark paper covered with writing that preserved memories and reflections that would otherwise have been lost. He recorded his confession to the 19 killings, described each death in detail that left no doubt about what he had done and why. The confession was not motivated by guilt. He felt no guilt for what he had done, but by a need to ensure that the truth would eventually be known, that Thomas's murder would not be forgotten, that the justice he had provided would be understood by whoever eventually found his remains. "I killed them for Thomas," he wrote in one entry. "I killed them because they killed my boy and called it justified. I killed them because the law protected murderers and abandoned victims. I killed them because it was the only justice available, the only answer to what they had done. I do not regret a single death. I regret only that I could not save my son, could not be there when he needed me, could not protect him from men whose badges gave them permission to kill children." He wrote about the war, about how the killing he had done in the Pacific had prepared him for the killing he had done in Kentucky. He described the nightmares that had followed him from the islands and that had been joined by new nightmares after Thomas's death. He explained how the solitude had become a mercy, a way of existing that did not require him to pretend that he was something he was not. "The world thinks I am a murderer," he wrote. "Perhaps I am, but the men I killed were murderers too, and their murders were protected by a system that called them justice. I became what the system refused to be. I provided what the system refused to provide. If that makes me a monster, then the system created me, and the system should bear responsibility for what I became." The journals continued for decades, filling notebooks that Ezekiel made from materials he gathered in the forest. He wrote about the seasons he observed from his hidden vantage points, the animals that he shared the mountain with, the thoughts that occupied a mind that had no one to share them with. He wrote about Thomas constantly, preserved memories of the boy in words that would outlast both of them. By the 1980s, Ezekiel was in his 70s, his body failing in ways that the wilderness could not reverse. The journeys to Thomas's grave became more difficult, required more time and more rest, eventually became impossible as his legs would no longer carry him over terrain that had once been easy. His last visit to the grave was in 1988, a journey that nearly killed him and that he knew would be his final one. He accepted the limitation with the same acceptance he had shown for everything else. He could no longer visit his son's grave, but Thomas was still with him, still present in memories that 40 years had not diminished. He spoke to the boy daily, held conversations that existed only in his mind, maintained a relationship that death had interrupted but had not ended. Ezekiel Fugate died in his cave on March 15, 1990, at the age of 77. He had lived alone in the wilderness for 42 years, had survived on skills that most people had forgotten existed, had maintained his sanity through a connection with a dead son that the rational world might have called madness, but that Ezekiel experienced as the only real thing remaining in his existence. His body was found 3 months later by hikers who had ventured deeper into Black Mountain than anyone had explored in decades. They discovered the cave entrance by accident, investigated out of curiosity, found a home that suggested occupation so prolonged that they could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The man they found had been dead for months, his body preserved by the cool darkness of the cave. He was sitting in a chair he had made himself, facing a wall on which photographs had been arranged with obvious care. The photographs showed a boy at various ages, from infancy to what appeared to be about 10 years old. Beneath the photographs carved into the stone itself were the words, "Thomas Fugate, 1937-1947, murdered by federal agents, avenged by his father." The journals were found nearby, dozens of notebooks that documented 42 years of solitude and that contained a confession to 19 killings that had never been solved. The investigators who eventually examined these materials found answers to mysteries that had baffled federal authorities for more than 4 decades. The case files on the mountain ghost killings were reopened, the new evidence examined with techniques that had not existed in 1948. The details matched perfectly. The victims, the methods, the timeline, everything that Ezekiel had recorded corresponded to evidence that investigators had gathered 40 years before, but had never been able to connect to a suspect. The revelation produced reactions that reflected the complexity of what had occurred. The federal agencies whose agents had been killed maintained that the deaths had been murders regardless of motivation, that nothing justified vigilante violence against law enforcement officers. The families of the victims, many of whom had spent decades wondering what had happened to their fathers and grandfathers, learned truths that were both answer and accusation. The families of Dale Tackett, the agent who had fired the shots that killed Thomas, discovered that their patriarch had killed a child and had been protected by a system that valued his career above a mountain boy's life. The evidence that Ezekiel had preserved, combined with documents that subsequent investigation uncovered, proved that the official narrative had been a lie from the beginning, that Thomas had never been armed, that the killing had been murder covered up by the agency responsible. The descendants of the other agents learned similar truths about their ancestors. Some had been willing participants in the cover-up, had helped construct the lie that protected Tackett and Crawford. Others had been complicit through silence, had known the truth, but had not spoken it. A few had been marginally involved, had participated in the raid, but had not known about the shooting until it was over. All of them had been killed by a father whose grief had become justice that the legal system had refused to provide. The moral philosophers who examined the case reached no consensus about whether Ezekiel's actions could be justified. He had killed 19 men over 5 months, had used skills that war had taught him to eliminate targets that the law protected. The horror of his methods was undeniable. The suffering he had inflicted was significant, even when the deaths themselves were quick. But his son had been murdered by men whose badges provided immunity, whose lies had been accepted by a system that should have sought truth, whose careers had continued unaffected, while a child lay dead. The father's vengeance had been the only response that the circumstances allowed, the only justice that would ever be achieved for Thomas Fugate. The legal scholars who analyzed the case debated whether Ezekiel could have been prosecuted if he had been discovered while still alive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, 19 killings documented in his own hand, but the evidence against his victims was equally damning. Would a jury have convicted a father whose son had been murdered and whose murderers had been protected by the system that should have punished them? The descendants of the Fugate family emerged from anonymity to claim Ezekiel's remains and to add his story to the family history that they had preserved through generations. They buried him beside Thomas in the cemetery where he had visited every year for 40 years, beneath a stone that bore an inscription they considered appropriate: Ezekiel Fugate, 1913-1990. He loved his son. The songs that emerged from the Ezekiel Fugate story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of what was done to Thomas and the horror of what his father did in response. The first verse described Ezekiel's return from war, the veteran who had survived the Pacific, only to find that his wife had died and his son was a stranger. The melody was melancholic, suggesting loss that preceded the greater loss to come. The second verse described the bond that developed between father and son, the hunting and fishing and working that created connection where words were inadequate. The melody warmed here, suggesting love that should have been allowed to grow and deepen. The third verse described the raid and the shooting, the federal agents who killed a 10-year-old boy because he ran toward a shed they were burning. The melody became terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The fourth verse described Ezekiel's grief and transformation, the father who became something else when his son's body was cold and the murderers were protected. The melody grew cold, suggesting calculation that had replaced feeling. The fifth verse described the campaign of vengeance, the 19 agents who fell one by one over 5 months, the mountain ghost that no one could catch. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that could not be escaped. The sixth verse described the 42 years of solitude, the cave where Ezekiel lived and the grave he visited. The son who remained alive in his father's memory long after the world had forgotten them both. The melody softened, became almost peaceful, suggesting existence that had found its own kind of meaning. The final verse described the discovery and the truth that emerged, the confession that solved mysteries 4 decades old, the answers that came too late for anyone to punish or pardon. The melody did not resolve, left listeners in uncertainty that matched the uncertainty of the story itself. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with intensity that reflected the complexity of what they had heard. The emotions evoked were not simple. The moral was not clear. The story did not end in any way that provided comfort or resolution. The grave where Ezekiel and Thomas rest side by side is still maintained by descendants who make the journey to the Fugate family cemetery each year. The cave where Ezekiel lived for 42 years has been preserved, its location known only to family members who have decided that some places should remain hidden from the curiosity of a world that would not understand what happened there. Some visitors to the cemetery report experiences that the rational world cannot explain. They hear sounds that should not be present, feel presences that observation cannot confirm, sense that the boundary between past and present has grown thin in places where such intense emotion was experienced. Whether these experiences reflect anything genuine or are merely the products of minds influenced by knowledge of what occurred, they contribute to the reputation of the Fugate property as a place where ordinary rules do not entirely apply. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Ezekiel and Thomas rest together? To read the inscriptions that promise they are finally reunited? Would you try to understand how a father's love could transform into violence so complete that it consumed 42 years of solitary existence? The journey to Harlan County is easier now than it was in 1947. The roads paved and the world more connected than it was when federal agents killed a boy for the crime of running toward a shed. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of fathers and sons rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of the man who lived 42 years alone after slaughtering 19 federal agents who killed his 10-year-old son. A story of war and peace and war again, of love that became grief, that became fury, that became decades of silence. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Ezekiel Fugate killed 19 federal agents who had murdered his son and been protected by the system that should have punished them, then disappeared into the wilderness for 42 years until his body was found with a confession that explained everything. What about you? If federal agents killed your 10-year-old son and the government protected them, what would you do? Could you survive 42 years alone with only your memories for company? Was Ezekiel Fugate a murderer? Or was he a father who loved his son in ways that exceeded what the law could contain? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some fathers love their sons so much that 42 years of solitude is preferable to a world where that love cannot exist anymore. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the fathers who call them home.